Good day to all. Let me introduce myself. I am Dr. Maheshwari, Associate Professor and Head, PG in Research Department of History, Sri Sarada College for Women, Autonomous, Salem 16. Today, let us see the topic Opening of China or First Anglo-Chinese War, or it is been also called as Opium War from the year 1839 to 1942. Let us see the causes of the war. The main cause of the war was the sale of opium by the Britishers in China. Relationship between Chinese and the English. The Chinese, particularly the Manchus, followed the policy of isolation for a long period. Moreover, the Chinese had a superiority complex and they called their empire as Celestial Empire and the emperor as Celestial Emperor. The Chinese called the Westerners as barbarians and uncivilized people and dollar grinders. Under the leadership of Captain Waldersee, however, only after 1699 the English began their trade in China. In the year 1715, English factory was set up at Canton after the passing of the Royal Edict of 1757. In the year 1793, Lord Macartney visited the Chinese court to get trade concessions in China. He was not able to get any success. He was followed by Lord Amherst and came to China in the year 1816 for the same purpose, but he left China without visiting the Chinese court because of the policy of Koto. The next cause was trade irregularities. There was a great deal of trade irregularities in China and by the British traders. Next was the Kohong monopoly. The Kohong merchants was a great barrier in trade in China. Next is the restrictions on foreigners. In 1835, the Chinese emperor passed certain regulations for foreign factories. They were foreign warships were not to enter China. Neither women nor guns and other weapons could be brought to the factories. All the rebel boats and ships were to be registered and also pilots were to get licensed. The number of Chinese servants should be restricted. Next comes the role of opium. The First Anglo-Chinese War is also known as the Opium War. The sale of opium became prominent in China from the beginning of the 18th century. At first, it was taken by the Chinese as medicine for smoking. In the year 1773, the monopoly of opium trade came to the hands of English East India Company. From that time, the English began to get a lot of profit by selling the opium. On the other hand, the Chinese lost their wealth and health also. So, a few Chinese called the English as the sons of Satans. Next comes Lin's arrogance. China appointed Lin Se-su as the commissioner of Canton to solve the problem of the sale of opium. Lin asked the foreign traders to hand over all the opium. Thus, the English were compelled to hand over 20,000 boxes of opium to Lin. Lin threw the opium into the sea and also demanded a promise from the English traders that in future they wouldn't carry on the opium trade. But the English were not ready to give this promise. They left their trade in the hands of the Americans and went to Macao. Thus, the relationship between the Chinese and the English became strained. Next comes the immediate cause. Under these circumstances, in July 1839, Lin Wei Siu, a village at Kowloon was beaten to death by the English sailors in a group clash. At once, Lin demanded from Elliot to hand over the criminal. Elliot refused, saying that in a group fighting, it was difficult to find out the criminal. Lin ordered the English to leave the Canton port at once. Elliot asked the English fleet from Hong Kong to attack the Chinese fleet. This resulted in the Battle of Chunpi in November 1839. Thus, the First Anglo-Chinese War began. A small English fleet defeated the entire Chinese naval force. Only in 1840, a war resolution was passed in the British prominent. The two agreements were concluded in May 1841. However, the war continued. The English came very near to Yangtze Valley. Finally, the Chinese agreed to conclude a peace treaty with England. So the Treaty of Nanking was concluded in August. Next, we'll see the results of the war. The Treaty of Nanking. The Treaty of Nanking, concluded in August 1842 between China and England, consisted of the following provisions. China agreed to open 5 Chinese ports, Canton, Amoy, Ningpo, Fuzhou and Shanghai, to English traders. These ports were called as treaty ports. The English were allowed to have their residence, factories and families at these ports. The Chinese permanently ceded the island of Hong Kong to England. The monopoly of Hong merchants came to an end. The British traders were allowed to trade with the Chinese traders directly. China was forced to agree a large indemnity of $12 million. She had to pay more $6 million for the opium that the English lost. The system of quota was abolished. Chinese had to pay $21 million to the English, and uniform and moderate tariff on import and export should be imposed. The custom duty was fixed at 5%, and all these provisions was an unequal one. Next comes the effects of the Treaty of Nanking. The Treaty of Nanking marked the beginning of unequal treaties. This treaty brought the enmity between China and England to an end for the time being. Its effects were far-reaching. It forced China to open her door for foreign trade and commerce. It also marked the beginning of economic imperialism of the European countries. Vinayake calls this treaty as a starting on cutting of the Chinese melon. Anglo-Chinese Treaty or the Treaty of Bow. The English merchants were not satisfied with the advantages and privileges they got from the Treaty of Nanking. They asked for extraterritorial right, and by concluding the Treaty of Bow in October 1847, they got that right. By the term, allowed to set up the court in treaty ports to decide the cases in which the British were involved. By giving this right, China lost her power over the British subjects on a soil. It was a disregarded and disgrace to the Chinese. The British also forced Chinese to include on the other provision the most favored nation clause treatment, that China should give all the concessions and privileges to the English which were granted to the other powers. The other unequal treaties. In 1844, an American crew came to China and concluded the Treaty of Shanghai in July 1844. It granted the Americans all the rights and privileges which were given to the English. The Americans enjoyed this right nearly for a century. France concluded the same kind of treaty with China in October 1844, known as the Treaty of Shanghai. Belgium, Norway, Sweden and Portugal concluded the treaties with China and received all the rights and privileges. They were called as unequal treaties because foreigners were given number of concessions without any profit and benefit to the Chinese. There were economic development in the treaty ports. Hong Kong and Shanghai developed the notable commercial sites and became centers of foreign trade. This development was completely enjoyed by the foreign merchants. The Treaty of Nanking thus forced China to open her door for the foreigners. Moreover, even after the war, the opium was continued. It increased the economic burden of China. The difficulties faced by the Chinese, particularly in South China, led the way for the outburst of Taiping Rebellion. Thus, the Treaty of Nanking in the year 1842 marks the opening of China to the Western influence of 19th and 20th centuries. Thank you.